So people talk about the gut as a second brain. Is it legitimate to describe it in those terms? Well, yeah, in some ways it is. We know that surrounding the gut there's a whole mass of nervous tissue, and we know that the gut communicates with the brain and vice versa through the vagus nerve, which I was taught at medical school. I dissected the vagus nerve in our anatomy classes, and we were told that this was exclusively one-way traffic. The brain instructs the gastrointestinal system. And you know very well that when you're stressed, for example, or very unhappy, that can have effects on the gut. Anything from indigestion to diarrhea. But more recently, what we've learned is that information in the vagus nerve isn't just one way. It doesn't just go from the brain to the gut, it goes the other way too. And for example, we know that if you have dysbiosis, that is an unhealthy collection of bacteria or microbes in the gastrointestinal tract, that could make you feel unhappy. We also know that there are certain bacteria, we think of the right kinds of bacteria, which if they're present in the gut make you feel much more upbeat. So there's an emotional traffic that goes up the vagus nerve, depending on what's happening in the gut, and it affects various aspects of the way you think and feel. We've also found that this nerve may be a transport system for other things as well, not just information, but possibly for viruses. So there's recent work which has established a strong connection between dysbiosis in the gut and Parkinson's disease, for example. Very recently, studies have been published showing that in the brains of people with Parkinson's disease, you find enteral viruses. These are viruses which are normally only present in the gut, but we think that under certain circumstances, if you have a dysbiosis, if you're not eating the right food, and the collection of microbes in the gut are wrong, viruses can travel up this nerve into the brain, and there start to cause the progressive destruction of brain tissue that leads to Parkinson's. We also know that in autism and in ADD, ADHD, again, there's very often a dysbiosis, and that creates situations in the gut where compounds which would not normally be absorbed are able to pass through the inflamed gut wall, get into the bloodstream, and cause confusion, interrupt the normal functioning of the brain. And then there's gut feelings. Gut feelings. Sometimes when you meet someone for the first time, you're just about to start a relationship, perhaps a business, and you think this is a good person to work with. Or maybe you think this is not the right person. You've ever had that feeling? And then very often we forget it. We overrule it because our conscious mind takes over. And very often later on we think, I should have listened to my gut. Because I made a conscious decision that was wrong. If I'd listened more carefully to what my inside was telling me, I would be in a better place, I'd be happier. How does that work? Well, it's very theoretical, but some very new work that's being done in Japan by some very interesting researchers suggests that it's something like this. The microbes that live inside you, in the gut, produce very small molecules which are volatile. You exhale them in your breath. They pass through the skin, in the sweat, maybe even in your tears and saliva. Who knows? We don't really know. And they get into the air, and when you meet someone, you inhale those very low molecular molecules. You can't smell them, it's way below that level. But enough of them get into the blood, they get into the gut, and they talk to the microbes in your gut. And those microbes then talk to you through the vagus nerve. This is what gut feelings may be about. And one of the reasons is that microbes have been around on this planet for 4 billion years. That's a lot longer than we have. And they have developed all kinds of ways of communicating with each other, which are very complex, very subtle, very complicated crosstalk that goes on. And that's 4 billion years of accumulated wisdom. We haven't been around for nearly as long. Maybe we should listen to the bacteria in our guts more carefully. One of the reasons why we don't, I think one of the reasons why our instincts so often don't work very well is that so many of us actually have the wrong population of microbes inside us. We have dysbiosis. And the reasons for that dysbiosis are because of the way in which the diet has changed. Well, over the last couple of centuries, but in particular, since World War II, over the last half century or so. And that has changed in a way which has really damaged our microbiome. It has reduced the ability of our second brain to work properly. It affects our thinking, it affects our emotions, it affects our ability to communicate with people. So in the gut brain, it's all about the microbiome, and one of the ways in which I intend to address this, and some of you I think have experienced this already, is to use prebiotic fibers, which we put into Zinobiotic. So this is a whole new dimension for Zinobiotic. We've talked about using it before to improve gastrointestinal function, but it's doing much more than that. It's affecting the microbiome in a way that we think impacts on almost every one of your physiological systems. So you store the microbiome, which we now call the holobiome, because the genetic makeup of the microbes in your gut, their biochemistry, and now it seems their ability to communicate integrates very seamlessly with our own. It's really a part of us. They're foreigners, but we have incorporated them profoundly into ourselves. We feed them with prebiotics. This is not nutrition for you exactly, it's nutrition for your microbiome. It's a natural product, tastes neutral, and we are now finding increasingly that this has a whole range of positive effects locally in the gut, but by changing the microbiome, that in turn has a whole array of positive effects on all of the rest of you, how you feel, how you think, how you behave. So we're feeding your symbionts, we're feeding the good bacteria, the ones that are the best tenants. And because the microbiome is so densely colonized, there's only a limited amount of space in there, there's only a limited amount of nutrition for these microbes, they're fighting a constant war against each other. They're communicating with each other, but a lot of that communication is hostile. If you feed the good bacteria, what they do is they are then able to fight off the bad bacteria. It's chemical warfare. The good bacteria make local antibiotics, if you like. They use to fight their corner. And when they do that, they actually kill off the bacteria that would otherwise harm you and impair your performance. Very profound and very intimate relationship. We are absolutely dependent on these. They affect us in so many ways. And the problem is that the modern diet, particularly if you're eating a processed food diet, so many of these prebiotic fibers, which feed the good bacteria, have been removed. It's one of the huge nutritional deficiencies of our time, which has not yet been properly recognized. And what that means is that as the good bacteria die off because they're being starved, the bad bacteria replace them. And the problem with the bad bacteria, well, they have many problems. They secrete, for example, toxic substances which create inflammation in the gut, which causes problems everywhere else. But one of the ways in which they do this is not just by secreting toxins, it's because of their cellular structure. Now, they're called gram-negative because they don't accept gram stain. In the beginning of microbiology, the difference was made between gram-positive and gram-negative microorganisms. Gram-positive microorganisms accepted a particular kind of stain, and even although the microbiologists of that time didn't know what that meant, it was a way of distinguishing between different classes of bugs. So the gram-negative bacteria don't accept this particular stain. Now we know why that is. It's because their cell walls are composed of compounds called lipopolysaccharides. The name doesn't matter, but lipopolysaccharides, or LPS for short, are very, very pro-inflammatory. So if you're eating a modern diet without enough of the prebiotics, the good bacteria die, the bad bacteria become overwhelming, they're coated with lipopolysaccharides. That creates a very, very hostile and unhealthy climate in the gut. It causes inflammation throughout the large bowel. That in turn sends messages to your brain. Messages which we now know leave you feeling less energetic, less happy, less contented, less sociable. If you eat the right diet, what happens is you become a happier, more functional, more sociable human being. The microbiome shifts away, the bad bacteria start to die, the amount of lipopolysaccharide in the gut is reduced, and now everything starts to return to a much healthier state of affairs. The gut is able to function as it should, and this crosstalk between the gut and the brain changes in tone. Instead of promoting unhappiness, instead of promoting a loss of energy, it makes you more sociable, more energetic, more able to function individually and socially. Now, we use probiotics to try to improve the microbiome, or at least the industry does. The food industry sells enormous amounts of probiotics because they've managed to convince you that it's a good idea to eat probiotic yogurts or yogurt drinks, things like that. And they contain the usual bacteria. These are lactobacilli, these are bifidobacteria, this is Strep thermophilus. These are the usual things that you'll find in, for example, yogurts or kefir, if they're live. But there is a problem with this approach. It doesn't work particularly effectively because these are bacteria that are tame. They're grown in stainless steel tanks, they're given everything that they need, they're kept warm and clean, free housing. They're tame. And not only are they tame and not very aggressive, they're not very helpful to us, but they're only present in very limited amounts. Each one of those bottles contains about 5 billion microbes. But when you consider the amount of microbes in the gut, when you take one of those bottles, the microbes in that bottle are outnumbered 300 million to 1 against. And if you take a probiotic capsule, they're still outnumbered 60 million to 1 against. They're fighting hopeless odds. And because these bacteria have been grown in very favorable conditions, that's like sending a party of Girl Guides to fight the Chinese army. Who's going to win that battle? Which is why when you take probiotics, they will have an ability to remain in the gut for a few hours, but the day after you stop taking the probiotics, they're gone. They're gone. They're wiped out. So what you need instead is to work with those good bacteria that have already demonstrated their survival skills, that are still able to survive inside you, and there will always be some, despite all the odds. These are hardened veterans. These are battle-scarred warriors, and all they need is for you to send them supplies. Give them what they need. And what they need are prebiotics. These are carbohydrates, non-digestible carbohydrates, that are present in many plant foods. Cereals, legumes, and other fruits and vegetables. There's different kinds. These are all what we call dietary fiber. They're not inert. Cellulose is an inert dietary fiber, like paper, for example, lignin. They just pass all the way through you. They have no effect whatsoever. But these particular carbohydrates are not digested. They don't break down into blood sugar. Instead, they break down into short-chain fatty acids, and the main ones are FOS, which you've heard of, which is a very interesting product. Never use it on its own. It's not a good idea at all. But inulin, 1,3,1,4-beta-glucans, and resistant starch. This is what FOS looks like. It's quite a small molecule. Inulin is simply a longer version of the same molecule. This is beta-glucans, 1,3,1,4-beta-glucans, and this is resistant starch. So I've gone from very small molecules to much larger and more complicated molecules. And the reason why it's important to use all these together is because when you eat these fibers, they pass into the gut and they pass through the gut. So when this blend of fibers first enters the colon, it's the very small molecules that are metabolized first. So they're fermented, it's a fermentation reaction, and as they ferment, they produce short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate. Butyrate is really, really important because it is anti-inflammatory, and it has a really interesting ability to kill a wide range of cancer cells. And those cancer cells that it does not kill, it instructs them to redifferentiate. And what that means in terms of a cancer cell, it tells it to act and behave and look more like a normal cell and stop behaving in a cancerous way. This is a very interesting educational program that these bacteria are able to provide to the body, providing us with help and support. So the FOS starts that reaction, but it doesn't last for long. It's like a relay race. Once it's used up, it passes the baton to inulin, which is longer and slower fermentation. It starts to ferment lower down the gastrointestinal tract. And then the 1,3,1,4 beta-glucans take over, and then finally the resistant starches take over. And in this way, you achieve transformation of the microbiome entirely throughout the gut. And this is what's actually happening in the gut. So this is a healthy situation where you're eating prebiotics, and the good bacteria, which are marked here in green, are inhabiting the mucosal layers. That is, they're very close to the cells of the lining of the gut. And they're talking to them, and they're saying to the cells that line the gut, yep, we know there's lots of foreign molecules around here from whatever food you've eaten, but don't respond to them too aggressively. Don't have too much of an immune reaction. We don't want a lot of inflammation. We need a certain amount, because inflammation is the way in which we interact with the outside world. And a certain amount of inflammation is all about keeping your identity, keeping your integrity. Small amounts of inflammation is a good and it's an essential thing. But what happens is, if the prebiotics are not present in the diet, the bad bacteria start to multiply. And what happens is, they start to eat into the mucus. They actually destroy the mucosal layer. They remove the healthy bacteria, and now these bad bacteria, which are coated with lipopolysaccharide, are in direct contact with the cells that line the gut. And this triggers not physiological low levels of inflammation, this triggers gross clinical chronic inflammation. And under those conditions, you see here that the tight junctions between the cell walls start to open up, and molecules which would otherwise not get into the bloodstream can now do so. And some of those molecules, derived, for example, from gluten or from casein, we now think there's quite good evidence that they have negative effects on the way in which the brain works. You start becoming confused, may reduce your intelligence, your ability to deal with data. You don't feel good. The inflammatory condition also produces pro-inflammatory mediators that circulate in the blood and also lead to you feeling lassitude. Basically, you don't feel well. Nothing strong, nothing clinical, nothing you put your finger on, but it means you're not operating at 100%. You're at 90% or 80% or 75%. So these are small but subtle changes in many people, but in some people they're extreme and they end up with clinical conditions such as autism, ADD, ADHD, and as I said before, Parkinsonism. What you have to do is to restore the microbiome to normal. You send in the prebiotics, restore the population of the healthy bacteria, they start to defend you. The way in which they're talking to your gut wall is profoundly healthy. They're reducing the level of inflammation to the point where you can start to function as you should. So we reduce chronic inflammation in the gut, you improve gastrointestinal health, but you also improve general health, and this has now been linked to better weight control and glucose control, but stamina and better mood. And what we're also seeing is that people seem to become more able to socially interact. Maybe it's because this 4 billion-year-old communication between my microbes and yours, or yours and your partners, starts to work in a better way. Very subtle. And I have to say that the science is not yet completely decided, but this is the picture that is starting to emerge. I'll very, very quickly talk about I see I've run over time. I do apologize. I'll stop here and leave you with the thought that if you look after your microbiome, it will help you in all kinds of ways. Some are very obvious, but some of them are very subtle and very profound. They may actually help you to make better decisions in life about who you want to be with, who you want to work with, and what kind of social animal you are. Thank you.